Well, hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to my living room. Actually, it's my study, but whatever. My book-filled space. I am Alex Bovey. My job is head of research at the Courtauld Institute in London, and I'm a member of the art history faculty. I'm a specialist in medieval art, and I don't think we're going to be talking about much medieval art in this evening's episode of Open Courtauld Hour, which is instead focusing on art and well-being, which is a subject that has always been important to us, but is, I think, suddenly and in some kind of surprising ways, incredibly relevant. And I'm going to be hosting this evening with my wonderful colleague Leila Bumbra, who is our Open Courtauld producer. And Leila is the person that we all have to thank for organizing this series. She very ingeniously translated our live research festival that was supposed to be a couple of weeks ago in London at Vernon Square into this series of hour-long specials, if you like, exploring different topics. And Leila is going to say a little bit about what this particular subject means to her in a second. I'm going to just say that for me and my family, art and well-being is, art is a big part of our well-being anyway, but with the kind of intense focus on the blessing that is the National Health Service in this country, it all became, I think, somewhat less abstract for my own family a couple of weeks ago when my 9-year-old daughter was admitted to King's College Hospital and out of the blue diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So my own family has been on a very intense journey over the past couple of weeks, and we're all okay. She's great. She's watching downstairs, and she's given me permission to say this as well. So hi, Zoe. But the importance of art and all of the arts to well-being is something really important to me and my family, and also across the Courtauld Institute community. And it's also been a subject that has been of international interest to researchers over the past, kind of growing interest over the past couple of decades. In my own native Canada, my mum is very involved in this field of study. And here in the UK, in 2014, an all-party parliamentary group on arts, health, and well-being was founded, and it's commissioned a number of very important studies which have helped to show to really surface the connections between the arts, all of the arts, not just the visual arts, and well-being, and also to begin to explore the ways in which the arts can help to bridge social inequalities as well. So some of those themes might come up tonight. Now, Leila, I think you'd like to say a few words too about this area and its importance to you.
Yeah, hi Alex. It's a little bit strange to actually be on camera for once rather than just behind the scenes. So I just wanted to say that the theme today is actually extremely core to Open Courtauld in general. So the strand is born out of the idea that art enriches lives anyway, and that we should open up and transform access and engagement to our research and collections to as wide and diverse audience as possible. And I think what has been so great about the first event and now tonight is, which is actually an accident of lockdown, is that we have been reminded that not everyone actually has the luxury to attend our events in a non-lockdown world. So this might be due to disability, location, or finances. So when lockdown is over and we've returned to some form of new normality, I think we really want to continue the momentum that we've already started here, in who we reach and also what we've learned. And I think it's really important time to push the boundaries, especially when there's so many people that are really relying on this as a form of well-being, actually. I also wanted to say as well, personally, I come from a predominantly NHS family. My parents are doctors, my stepdad's a doctor, and actually all of my friends from school are classified as key workers, and I'm the only one that isn't. But my family and friends have always really valued art, and even if that's artistic practice or just viewing art, as an affecting thing for humans. And I think the more events you program, clearer it becomes that art's value goes further than enjoyment. Access to artistic pursuits, however they are, can be invaluable. And I think now more than ever, as a way to express your emotions, art can have the capacity, whether physically or emotionally, when you can't use words. And I think that's something that a lot of people have found it's a really useful tool generally. And I think that's something that we want to bring up a lot today.
Well, thank you so much, Leila, and for putting this installment together. And now I think what we'll do is crack on with the wonderful program that you have fixed up. And I will just say that last week we had very exciting, I mean, speaking of arts and well-being, I think it might have been a kind of major crisis in Leila's well-being last week, that as the Zoom filled up with people, and actually I should say hello, we've got 665 and growing, 666 kind of diabolical number of people joining us, so welcome to all of you. As everyone filled up Zoom on Leila's computer, it zoomed up and collapsed. And so we weren't able to, we kept the show on the road, but we weren't able to ask questions, to field questions. This week we're really keen to put your questions to our speakers. And we'll do that by asking you to tweet us at CourtauldRes and using the hashtag hashtag Open Courtauld Hour. And you can also email at researchforum@courtauld.ac.uk. So now I think I've got the computer organized as it should be to introduce our first contributor this evening, who is, I'm very kind of proud to say, a member of the Courtauld Institute's governing board. And I hope he'll turn his camera on in a second, but while he does, I'll say welcome to Leszek Borysiewicz, who is known to us at the Courtauld and I think really throughout his life as Boris. Boris is chair of Cancer Research UK and former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. And before that, he was chief executive of the UK's Medical Research Council. And before that, at Imperial College London, where he was the principal of the Faculty of Medicine. And in 2001, he was knighted in the New Year's Honours List for his contribution to medical education and research, especially in developing vaccines, which I think makes him extremely relevant voice to welcome to Open Courtauld Hour. So hello, Boris.
Hello, Alex. It's great to see you again. To start my presentation, I'm going to share my screen once I have got the presentation up and running. So hopefully, is that up, Alex?
Perfect, loud and clear. Okay.
Okay. Well, my name is Leszek Borysiewicz. Good evening, all. And this is a personal reflection on the way in which images and art reflect in medicine. It doesn't touch too much on well-being because from my background as a physician who specialized in infectious diseases and latterly in cancer research, this reflection is very much about illness and the impact it has on us and the way in which art portrays it. But visual art can have fantastically huge impacts. Starting off with this image of a picture created by Luke Fields, commissioned by Henry Tate, is actually a commentary on an illness of his own daughter who was aged 1. However, its impact was huge. In its print copy, this sold over 1 million copies in the United States at the turn of the 19th century. But in today's world, there is some discomfort in this picture. Firstly, is it likely that in the poor environment in which this patient is found, they would actually have had access to the healthcare provided by the doctor? That's a very important question. And the second is the detached nature of the clinician. He is staring at the patient, but the patient is completely oblivious to him. So is there an element of performance in all of this for the sake of the relatives in the top right-hand corner? But it does raise those issues of access and poverty. My background in infectious diseases means that there is often a focus on pestilence epidemics, and today, of course, that's very real to all of us. But fascinatingly, artists have found this topic real as well. Whether it's in this scene of Quebec, a cholera outbreak in Quebec in the mid-19th centuries, to medieval depictions of the plague, or the plague in Marseille in the 19th century, artists seem to be fascinated with the impact that plague actually has. But there's also a very positive way in which Typhoid Mary, who was a spreader of typhoid, even though she herself was not affected, is seen in this French poster, where it's trying to get the message across of the impact of typhoid to the population. So it has the capacity to impact, but it also tells us what sort of impact it had on populations in the distant past. And perhaps this is best exhibited in Peter Bruegel's depiction of the triumph of death. There were many grisly ways of sloughing off the mortal coil in medieval times, be it from judicial execution to natural disasters as portrayed in the upper part of this picture. But fascinatingly, despite all of these various gruesome endings to life depicted in this constellation of images, the plague plays a huge part. Death is seen riding the horse that is carrying the plague cart to the hereafter. So disease and pestilence has always been and always had a huge impact. But art itself can actually impact and change things for the better. Hogarth's depiction of Bethlem was very clearly changed attitudes towards mental health and well-being. And who can fail to be moved by this picture of Traversy, of an operation being conducted at that time without anesthetic? The very visceral pain that the subject is experiencing surely is the best advertisement for anesthesia that has ever been created. But art can also point out charlatanism, which abounds today as much as it did in the past. I'm always taken by this smile on the barber surgeon's face as he is extracting the stone of madness. This was an operative procedure whereby an incision was made in the forehead of a patient who suffered from various forms of madness, and the assistant to his right-hand side at the appropriate moment would surreptitiously slip a stone into the wound, which was then extracted with great glee by the surgeon, claiming cures, much to the acclamation of well-placed witnesses in the foreground. But art also has captivated artists who depict patients and their care in a variety of ways. And I'm going to pick on 4 examples of these. And these, there could be many to choose from, but these are my particular favorites. The first of these is with Edouard Vuillard. And the first image is that of his 15-year-old sister who's in the throes of mumps. And what we see here is that she turns away from the painter because she doesn't want her countenance portrayed while she's in the throes of mumps. And what she now has is her jaw wrapped up, as used to be the old way of trying to relieve the pain of the swollen salivary glands that are caused by mumps. However, by her looking away, of course, it allows Vuillard to give full expression to his marvelous ability to paint textiles. He now then goes on to depict something that happens day in, day out in medical practice, the ward round. But what he does here is he does not put the medical figures center stage. Center stage is the patient, and that is a fundamental truth of all depictions of healthcare. In this picture, he then portrays an operating theatre of around about 1913. That is as stark an image as you could want, would be just as relevant today as it was in 1913. What's particularly endearing about this picture is the wonderful foreshortening from the raised legs of the patient, this autotransfusion that used to be used in the early part of the 20th century. And it's so beautifully depicted here. But ultimately, healthcare is not about the doctors or the patients or the carers. It is about the patient themselves. And this is Edward Munch's depiction of his 15-year-old sister who is dying of tuberculosis. For clinicians, the way Munch depicts the waxy pallor of the patient, so typical of terminal stages of tuberculosis, is quite captivating. But also he captures this detached countenance of the individual patient, particularly when they are seriously ill. However, it also makes the point that the patient is not alone, and that indeed the whole family is affected. And therefore treating the patient means treating the family. And not to give up hope. This lurid medicine that is present here expresses hope to both the patient and the relatives, even though today we know it would have been fundamentally useless. And the impact of this scene stayed with Edward Munch throughout his life, because he came back to it time and time and time again, depicting both the death of his sister, but also images through various media of her last days and through the whole of her illness. For me, a particularly important group of pictures were those painted by the Swiss expressionist painter who then specialized in parallelism, Ferdinand Hodler. In 1908, he fell in love with Valentine Godet-Darel, who tragically in 1913 was diagnosed with a gynecological cancer, most probably cancer of the cervix. And this is a condition that I've spent much of my life investigating. She firstly had an operation, and here you can see her after that first operation. Unfortunately, it was too late. And what happened is the disease progressed. And he captured through a series of images the impact of cancer on the patient. From the left-hand picture, you can see the fact that she's already becoming emaciated. She's in some turmoil, she's in stress. And then you see the exhaustion, where she is completely detached from the viewer. She had a second operation, but again, that detachment continues in this particular picture. And he painted her daily through the last months of her illness, finally culminating in this picture, which is the picture of her the day before her death, now emaciated, completely detached, and really exhausted by the travails of cancer. And it's this sort of image that drives all of us in cancer research to the very fact that we want to prevent this happening today. And lastly, but by no means least, I'd like to lighten the atmosphere a little. And this is a particular favorite of mine. Gwen John painted multiple depictions of the convalescent in the early 1920s. The questions abound. We have no idea who the sitter is, or why this series of paintings were actually painted by Gwen John rather late in her oeuvre. But it is undoubtedly a convalescent, but there is something of a beautiful serenity about this picture. And I particularly like this because as Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, I was lucky enough to have this hanging in my lounge for about 4 months and could study it day in, day out. And all that I can say is it might depict a convalescent, but when you look at it and you look at this image, you actually begin to really believe that art itself can heal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I think it's really striking when you think about the parallels between art made during historic pandemics and the art made today. So a lot of the images you saw at the start, the idea of the invisible killer, of a war, of a battle, and the sacrifice that people were making, I think that's coming up again in what we're seeing in the images like Banksy's of the superhero nurse,
Yeah.
and also even the images we have of NHS staff with the marks on their faces. So I think that's fascinating. So we have quite a few questions from the audience. The first one is from Alex, who's asking, I find that paintings that depict horror and suffering tend to be more popular or well known than happiness or relaxation. What do you think that means about humanity and our mental health?
I think actually it's probably easier to depict the drama, particularly that surrounds the issue of ill health. And I think some of the artists tried to capture this first and foremost in their depictions. What's slightly different about the art we're beginning to see from the current pandemic, it is more about the people involved. And I find that really much more interesting, which is why I find those pictures of Hodler and of Munch so particularly relevant, because they're about the individual. They're not trying to depict the horror or the ghastliness of the condition that they've got, but rather focus on their experience of that particular illness. And you must remember that as a practicing physician, one of the things that I was experiencing is actually experiencing that contact with the patient. And that's maybe why I'm so captivated by those images of the patients themselves, rather than any horror-filled area that Bruegel or others might have portrayed in earlier times.
Yeah, no, I agree personally. I think the images that are humanizing make it more tangible. And I think if you can see something and see a human's reaction, it makes it more real in some ways. So we have another question from Louise. Do you think the role of art and well-being is evolving as we speak? And if so, how?
I think it is evolving. It is something that it is still probably open to question as to how far art can heal. But there's very little doubt that art in all its forms, whether it's through literature or whether it's through drama or elsewhere, allows us a form of escapism into a different world, to be able to move away from the actual focus on the ill health that we see depicted in the pictures that I've chosen. But it is very, very important that art itself is something that becomes important to the individuals concerned. How often have we heard already patients' experience of the current pandemic talking about a book that they'd actually wanted to finish reading, or that they wanted to see their family, or they wanted to see images of different sort. Images really do matter to us. They speak to us very directly. And I think for that reason, visual art for me in particular is so important.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions we have just now from our audience. So I'll pass back to Alex, who might have a question of her own, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Boris. That was really moving as well, the series of images that you showed. So now we're going to say goodbye to Boris, just temporarily, not forever, and introduce our next contributor, who is the artist Michaela Ross. Michaela lives and works in London. She is not alone, I believe, wherever she is. She has a animal companion named Bob, so we might hear from Bob. She is research lead at the Bethlem Gallery and also a visiting lecturer in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London, and an associate lecturer at Goldsmiths, also part of the University of London. And you can find her on Twitter at Michaela1Ross. And so over to you and back to Layla, I think, for your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Michaela again. Thank you for joining us. I know you've had a lot of major internet issues, and I'm pretty sure most people can sympathize with that right now. So I think Grace is going to share some slides for you, and what I wanted to ask you first is if you could tell us a little bit more about Bethlem Gallery, because it's definitely a unique gallery in its physical situation as well as its mission. So I'm sure everyone would love to hear about that.
Absolutely. First, I just wanted to pick up on something that I noted in Boris's wonderful talk about the key issue of representation. And I think this idea of who is represented, how they're represented, is a core concern, really. And very often when I'm asked to give these talks on behalf of the Bethlem Gallery, I feel kind of that I'm committing the cardinal sin, really, of speaking on behalf of others. So I really hope that the works that I'm going to show will speak for themselves to a certain extent. But I really wanted to maybe pick up on later this idea of, you know, who is represented and how is illness and health represented, and what that means in terms of its impact, particularly on the people with lived experience. But the Bethlem Gallery was founded in 1997. We're situated uniquely, I think, within a psychiatric hospital, a busy research hospital. And it came about because there were many people on site that were kind of producing artwork, rediscovering art practice sometimes. And we wanted to kind of create a professional environment for that work to be shown. And that's evolved over the years. Now we kind of occupy this extraordinary Art Deco building alongside the Museum of the Mind, which holds all of the archives of historic Bedlam, going way back to the 13th century. So that's our sister organisation, and we both inhabit this kind of same space. But it's really interesting, I think, curating exhibitions and kind of establishing research networks in the very heart of a psychiatric hospital, because our audiences, I think, come along to the gallery with all kinds of expectations, which sometimes we try to dislodge a little bit or disturb.
Yeah, that's so interesting as well. If I think it's so important to say that who's represented and how we read that is always going to come into play and be really important in everything that a gallery does. So do you think that people enter the gallery with a predetermined idea of value when it comes to the artworks on display in the space because of who they're made by?
Absolutely. So you can imagine if you kind of like walk through the gates of the hospital and kind of arrive at the doors of the gallery, you are already primed to read the work that you see inside the gallery in a certain kind of way. And for me, at least, there are certain kinds of dominant narratives that many people bring along with them when they kind of encounter the work. And we have kind of multiple and varied audiences. So kind of, you know, people that can range from the general public, from people who are interested in the history of the gallery and the museum, to members of staff, to service users. But very often this is kind of, I think there's a tendency to kind of approach the art and try to understand something of the person's personal, sometimes medical history by looking at the work, as if the artwork were a symptom of mental ill health. And that's a narrative that we work very strongly against, I think, because it's almost like substituting the person for the artwork. This idea that you could kind of read the symptoms of a person's medical history in an artwork is too narrow, I think, an interpretation, but you know, a common tendency, I think, amongst our audiences. Secondly, I mean, with this kind of recent kind of discussion around the relationship between arts and well-being, I think there is perhaps a tendency to want to view art making and art showing as a kind of calming, ameliorative situation, that art is a distraction, that art is something that you use to escape from challenging circumstances and situations. But I think really that's also too narrow a kind of understanding of well-being and the role of art in kind of mental health. I very much want us to perhaps discuss later this idea that well-being or living well is more about kind of thriving, it's about flourishing, it's about agency, it's about having some kind of control, again, over how you reflect upon your own life story, and how you kind of reflect outwards to others. I'm also kind of quite interested in this whole issue of care, I suppose, and like you, I come from an NHS family. I come from a family of nurses, and so when I started working at the hospital, I think kind of I was really interested in this idea of the kind of the pedagogy of care, I suppose, or, you know, curating as a practice of care, and having kind of care for the people that I work with. and that care being about kind of respecting their particular position and kind of trying to, as best I can, to give a platform to communicate how they want to be seen by others.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard when sometimes people want a one-size-fits-all solution to everything, but each person is different and each case is different, and the complexities of that, it must be so hard to manage. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you confront these issues head on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like last year, every year I curate a research exhibition, and last year the topic was art and value. So it was an attempt really to kind of tackle some of these issues about what is the value of art practice on site in kind of healthcare settings. What is the value of having a gallery in a psychiatric hospital? Who does it serve and how? And there were 4 artists involved. We saw work previously by Beth Hopkins and Sarah Carpenter, but I wanted to talk in particular about this work by Robin Smith. So the exhibition was set up in a way that the artists were put in conversation with different researchers and research units over at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's. And they entered in kind of conversation with different research units. I'm just looking at my notes. And Robin was in conversation with the Department of Cognition, Schizophrenia and Imaging Lab. And it was a really kind of fascinating conversation. She began to see the researchers, I suppose, as allies, in that they would kind of test some of the kind of interpretations of the world that she had together. And she spoke really movingly, I think, about how the whole process of entering into this kind of research conversation with academics allowed her to kind of pass from the persona of patient, you can see here on the left-hand side with the gown, with the medical gown, to the persona of co-researcher. So she's there in her lab coat and with her kind of clipboard. And the final exhibition really was about this kind of, she spoke about how she'd always kind of experienced herself as the object of research rather than the subject of research, and that she kind of felt like she was a lab rat, and she welcomed the opportunity to kind of like turn the tables in this kind of situation through art to become a co-researcher and to kind of offer herself up as a willing participant in research trials. And so it's something about this idea that kind of artists are the people who get to tell their own story. I think kind of people who have direct lived experience of mental health services are so used to being interpreted by others that it's kind of really important that they can kind of like flip the coin and become the ones who kind of offer up their own interpretations of their own kind of experiences. So this idea of kind of like maybe for Robin, I don't know, like I said, I wouldn't want to put words into her mouth, but this idea of kind of having agency and control over how you kind of communicate your experience and kind of, convey, your newfound status is an important part of well-being.
Yeah, definitely. I think we can't underestimate how extraordinarily impactful that must be to have that change, to go from feeling one way to feel like the agent of your own life again. And I think that what you're saying, it's really clear that the patients were, definitely able to challenge the ways that people viewed them through this space and take back control of their own story. So great that the supplementations of arts in Bethlem Gallery has actually proven to foster an environment for their growth, and also to have you here today to talk about this. It's so great. I just wondered if you had any other artists that you wanted to talk about right now.
Could you go on to the next slide really quickly?
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about quickly, in the same exhibition, we were working with an artist called Leon B, who was working with the Psychological Medicine and Integrated Care Unit, which looks at the kind of the overlap between physical and mental health. And his work is absolutely fascinating in the same way that it's about kind of having agency over the way that you are interpreted, over the way you see yourself and over the way others see you. So he was in conversation with a particular researcher who used these kind of standard health forms that were kind of like a tick box form to try and kind of gauge people's well-being and their quality of life. And the researcher herself talked about how much of a blunt tool these kind of questionnaires were, because they didn't give adequate weight to the kind of like personal individual aims and desires within that particular framework. And a lot of the work was about trying to kind of work out why certain aspects of physical health were important to people's mental well-being. So Leon, when he first arrived at the ward, he knows that his physical fitness is really an important component of his mental well-being. So he began to kind of pace the corridors of the ward on arrival to try and keep his fitness levels up, because he knew this was kind of really vital to his personal well-being. But he spoke kind of really interestingly about how ward staff completely misread this kind of pacing of the wards, thinking it was a kind of an indication, a sign of anxiety. But it was actually just him about kind of like entering another space and kind of keeping his fitness levels up. So his artwork was, there's a special machine on the wards in the hospital that cuts out the kind of ward on the floor. And he started to kind of retrieve these cut out worn pieces of lino, paint them, reintegrate them into kind of the hospital floor, and we've still got the floor actually in the gallery space now, and kind of reposition them as art, and to use that as a way of really eloquently speaking about this kind of how well-being is a personal, individual experience.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michaela. And everything we've just talked about really reminds me of my first job in the arts, which was actually with Joyce Lang, who started Pitman Arts Festival, which is where I worked, and she also founded a lot of art therapy in Scotland. So it's really interesting to hear from an urban context about that instead of rural Scotland. That's great. So I'll pass back over to Alex just now. Thank you, Michaela.
Thanks, Michaela. We've only got time for one question, but it's a biggie. So if you can, it's a question from Fern, who's asking that at the moment it's quite easy to think of the arts as a kind of luxury, especially with the financial storm that's starting to envelop us. I mean, what would you say about that?
Well, I don't know. I kind of think about care is political, economical, social. We've realised now, kind of with the kind of catastrophe of the situation in kind of caring environments, about the impact on the most vulnerable. I think I think art, if you understand it as there was kind of a really interesting kind of like declaration by the UN that said kind of access to cultural resources is a human right. It's not a luxury. It's not something that's supplementary. It's not something kind of that's an add-on. It's about the way we understand ourselves and the way we understand the world. And I think, if it's recognized at the level of the UN, then we really need to kind of, work hard to kind of like, center it really in all of our kind of, caring structures, I think.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I mean, I think that it's one of the things that as arts workers, we're going to have to get better at making, a good sharp case for why it matters, outside our outside our own Teams groups and Zoom meetings. Thank you so much for sharing your work. And now it's time to introduce our next speaker, who is Rebecca Chamberlain. And Rebecca is a psychologist who works at Goldsmiths College at the University of London. She's at Chamberlain RS on Twitter, and her research centers on how and why people create and respond so powerfully to works of art. So, Rebecca, I'm getting confused by my own Zoom screen. It's maybe something that it could be a subject for study, Zoom exhaustion.
Absolutely, yes.
Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks very much. Right, so I'm going to share a presentation with you. Just get that going. Okay, so yeah, I'm somewhat of a usurper in this session, I guess, along with Boris, in that I come from the sciences. So I'm a psychologist based at Goldsmiths, but my research is oriented around the psychology of art and aesthetics, and I'm going to talk to you today about some sort of thinking and research I've been doing around slow looking, and this was catalysed by a tour I ran at the Tate Modern last year as part of their Pierre Bonnard exhibition, where I was looking sort of at the value of slow looking and how this interacts with what we know about the brain. But I wanted to first comment on this idea of the sort of the value of art, and I think Michaela was really right in sort of pointing out that sometimes we can have somewhat of a narrow-minded kind of understanding of the impact of the arts. But I think that's changing in the field of psychology and behavioural science, and there's been some really nice work culminating in a World Health Organization report published last year by Daisy Fancourt, who's based at University College London, and she really talks about the kind of myriad benefits of the arts for both physical and mental health, in terms of enhancing sort of self-identity and self-esteem. So that's very much sort of building up this kind of art making and viewing, developing our self-concept, and obviously the critical importance of the social side of art, so bringing people together, connecting people, enabling them to communicate, and the fact that these have wide benefits for indicators of stress, but also sort of cognitive stimulation and physical health benefits as well. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted in the session today, but I wanted to sort of make the point that at least from an epidemiological standpoint, there seems to be really solid evidence that that both making and experiencing art is really good for our well-being. And sort of where I'm coming from in terms of this debate is sort of trying to look a bit deeper and thinking about perhaps the mechanisms by which engagements with the arts might benefit our well-being. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what is happening in the brain when we're having experiences with works of visual art. So this is a study by a researcher called Ed Vessel, and this shows that when we report having an experience with art that we would classify as moving, so this is a really kind of fundamental and deep connection with a work of art, we see activation in sort of two broad brain regions. First, the visual cortex, which is the part of the brain that deals with visual information. That's not so surprising. But we also see really interesting interrelations between that and what's called the default mode network, which is a network of brain regions that together are often focused on processing when we haven't got much to do, so kind of mind-wandering type states. And it's a lot about kind of internally driven thought. So what's interesting about these experiences with art is that it's switching on both kind of externally centered aspects of processing, so the visual side, but also introspection and thinking about ourselves and connecting that. So I think in some ways this might be what makes art special, that it hinges on these two things, where experience with other things in our environment don't do so in the same way. So I guess this all seems really nice. So we know that the arts is good for our well-being. It seems to have really interesting implications in terms of how the brain is processing artworks. But I suppose the sad truth, and I'm sure this is something that we've all experienced, is that we have normally quite fleeting experiences with works of art in the gallery. So a piece of research by Lisa and Jeffrey Smith, who are psychologists, a few years ago in Chicago showed that on average, visitors to the gallery spend just 20 seconds looking at a particular work of art. And as I said, I think we've all experienced this when we go to sort of blockbuster exhibitions. so it sort of got me thinking when I was developing these ideas around slow art and Pierre Bonnard that I suppose an open question is whether the benefits of the arts are contingent on being able to pay attention and sustained attention to works of art, you know, the extent to which that is important. And a sort of related idea to this is really this understanding that learning to look is something that we develop over time, and especially sort of artists who are watching this will sort of engage with that. They'll know that looking is not a passive process. So it might seem like we're all experts in perception, but as a practicing artist, you sort of develop a way of attending and looking. And so sort of communicating that and understanding how that can function in the gallery to give people a richer experience of works of art, I think is a really interesting question for psychologists. And so I've just started doing a bit of research in this field, and it's really sort of very early days, but I've been working with some curators and the Wellbeing team at Manchester Art Gallery, who launched a very successful exhibition called And Breathe, in which they were really trying to encourage people to have slow interactions with art. And we're looking a bit at what sort of mediates these interactions. So is it enough to provide a space in which people feel that they can slow down and pay sustained attention? Do we need guidance in terms of how we're interacting with the space? Does what we're bringing to the space have an impact on how we're experiencing it? And sort of future goals for this kind of research is to look at what are the long-term effects. And this is where, yeah, this idea of the difficulty around really understanding what well-being means to people is really important. So we want to be able to use tools that are nuanced enough to really capture the diverse benefits of slowing down and paying attention. And finally, it would sort of, I mean, I think this question is hanging in the air hugely at the moment, is whether we can have any form of kind of slow and meaningful interaction with art online. And a great many galleries are getting their works up in digital reproduction form or virtual gallery tours. But there's very little research on sort of what the difference is between in-person experiences with art and online experiences with art. And I think this is really important, not just for our times under Corona, but also because, as Layla mentioned at the beginning of this session, this idea of accessibility is really addressed by providing really good online resources for experiencing art. So I think there's just so much interesting work to be done in looking at what are the differences between experiencing art online and the gallery. How can we sort of celebrate the differences between online and in-person interactions and really magnify those in the service of well-being? So if you're interested in this kind of issue of slow looking in art, I've written a blog post on the Goldsmiths Psychology website, and I've made a tiny URL here for it, and I'll include it on the next slide here, and hopefully that can stay up for a couple of seconds. So thanks very much for listening.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That just opened so many fascinating questions, and I think ones that we'll be thinking about in the Courtauld Institute as we prepare to reopen our gallery with a new hang, and we're thinking quite hard about how audiences interact with our small but rich collection, so as not to be overwhelmed. I've got one question we've got time for one question that Stephanie is asking, which is about the differences, if you know what they are. Maybe it's a bit of a tough one, but the differences between making art and looking at it. There's a kind of quite strong impulse that people have to see and to look and to examine and then to make. And I wonder if you have know of any research that explores those kinds of connections.
Yeah, I've actually done some research on graffiti art actually, and looking at actually there are really interesting relationships between making and viewing art. So what we're finding in some research is that when I look at a piece of art, and I really noticed this in Boris's talk with when you're looking at sort of painful stimuli, is that your body, as Boris said, you have a visceral response to that, to those artworks. And so, so we have, a visceral response to artworks and what's depicted in them. We also seem to have an embodied response to the manner in which artworks are made. I think this is developed through the practice of art making. So someone who has a lot of experience with drawing and painting might have stronger responses than someone who has less experience. So I think there are actually more sort of commonalities than you would think, and I think that sort of speaks to the history of art making. When we look back far into our evolutionary past, we know that there was much more sort of integration between making and viewing art. So I think it's still an open question, but it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can try to restore the link, bring it back. Okay, Rebecca, thank you so much for your fascinating presentation and for joining us this evening. And so I'm going to take this back to Leila for the final time so that Leila can introduce this evening's poet.
Great, thank you, Alex. So we're so happy to welcome our wonderful performer this evening, who is Jasmine Cooray, who will be reinterpreting our Design for a Painted Ceiling of Painted Hall for Greenwich Hospital by James Thornhill. So Jasmine is a poet and counsellor based in London. She writes, facilitates workshops in creative writing, and supports the development of emerging writers. So Jasmine has performed in a variety of settings, including the Tate Modern, the Royal Festival Hall, and various other venues across London and the rest of the UK. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us, and I will hand it over to you to say a few words about your work you chose from the collection, which is very fitting to the theme. Thank you, and begin the performance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi everyone watching and listening. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to everyone who has spoken already. So I'm hoping that the tech wizard will bring up the sketch. Look at that, tech wizard. So this is on the left-hand side. This is a sketch designed for the ceiling of the Painted Hall in Greenwich Hospital, and it's by James Thornhill. It's made in around 1707. And on the right is the finished painting. I don't know if that's the restoration or if it's the old painting. And I really was inspired by how this sort of reminded me of when faces look down. And I was thinking about when you're in hospital and you wake up, and if you have people around you, their faces are looking down on you. But it also struck me that this drawing and the subsequent painting are very grand. And in contrast, it made me think about all the ordinary beauty that you might experience when you are in a hospital, either if you're working in a hospital or being treated in a hospital. So I wanted to write a piece about all those small forms of beauty. And I called this piece Local Artists, because I think there's a lot of local art that makes its way into hospitals, and local musicians that come into hospitals to work. So we can say bye to the slides now, and I will read this poem for you. Local Artists. When I can't roam over mountains or paddle in ocean spray, when the chatter, whoop and rustle of the woods is far away, when there's a little too much concrete for me to hear the thunderstorm, and the beeping of machinery pecks my eardrums frayed and worn, when the ward sounds are small bruises, murmured pain from other beds, gasps between the tears of visitors, wiping cheeks and holding heads, and you wish things of your body that just aren't the way things are, and your head is like a prison, but with dread instead of bars. Give me the nurse's pink and vivid hair, her tattooed collarbone, and the lilt of the doctor's voice, smiling eyes that feel like home. Give me ceilings cracked like marble, sketch for a painting yet to come, a joyful, tuneless happy birthday, spirits lifted up with song. Or that lady's ukulele, and her voice of nightingale, and her Hollywood red lipstick, and her beautifully sung tales. Give me faces waiting over me, speaking gently as I wake, lovely as a chapel ceiling, soothing as a breaking wave. Give me clumsy homemade get well cards, sticky, glittery and soft. And all the coloured scrubs in here, ice blue, cherry, moss. And the paintings in the corridors, I like the one where horses gallop, dust rising up around their hooves, ready to leap out from the canvas. Give me every piece of art you make, and all the art you are, and all the art you didn't know was just in loving hard. Give me all these sweet slivers of life, and life is here all right, brushing over us with colour, keeping hope lit through the night. And you know that you can trust the hand that's guided by the heart, and that heart beating like a drum wakes your soul up with a start. So you want to join the drumming, want to add your music too. Yes, there's beauty all around you here, worth living for, it's true. Thank you.
Jasmine, thank you. That was really beautiful. And the phrase that you used at the beginning, ordinary beauty, I'll take away with me as well. Thank you so much for sharing that wonderful
You're
poem.
welcome.
And now we've reached the end of our second Open Courtauld Hour. I want to thank the participants this evening, Boris, Rebecca, Michaela, and Jasmine, and Layla for organizing and hosting, my behind-the-scenes team, Fern and Grace and Acacia, for making the technology work so seamlessly and bossing us around on WhatsApp. And to say that next week we're going to be back in the same slot with a session exploring the future of art history, when I think some of these themes about the importance of the visual arts and their kind of urgent relevance to the present moment are going to be explored. And I'm just going to close out by thanking the 700 or so people who tuned in, and also by just saying a word about our students at the Courtauld Institute, many of whom are studying right now in quite different circumstances than they'd imagined they would be, and my colleagues who are working really hard to support them through screens rather than in classrooms. But still, I think a lot of we've been able to digitize a lot of the warmth that we have in our teaching operation. And one of the things that we're doing right now is raising money through the Courtauld Fund to support students at what is, I think, an unexpectedly challenging time. So if you have enjoyed this evening, and if you would like to support our students, then please visit the Courtauld's website, and you'll find a link to our scholarships page and to the Courtauld Fund. So with that, that's all from me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll see you in my study this time next week. Good night.